Nowhere to Call Home by Cynthia DeFelice, Chapter 6. Frances ran for 4 blocks before she dared to stop and catch her breath. From the street corner where she stood, gasping, she looked out into the West Philadelphia freight yard. Behind a wooden fence, a bewildering maze of tracks crossed and recrossed, stretching off in the distance as far as she could see. This was where the freight trains loaded and unloaded and were directed on to their next destination. Unlike the passenger cars, which had windows, plush seats, and electric lamps, these were sturdy working cars. Some, Frances noticed, were flat cars, piled high with lumber, long steel beams, even automobiles and farm machinery. Others with sides and tops had to be the boxcars Junius had spoken of. She wriggled through a gap in the fence, ignoring the large no trespassing sign, walked out into the yard, and wandered between the sets of tracks. With interest, she noticed that the huge wooden doors on the sides of the boxcars slid to the side to open and close, and that some of the cars stood empty, with their doors ajar. She liked reading the names painted on the sides of the cars: Southern Pacific, Pittsburgh and West Virginia, Great Northern, B&O, and Union Pacific. As she walked by a signal tower, one of the trains let out a whistle and a cloud of steam, and began to move slowly down the track. Frances watched the seemingly endless line of freight cars with fascination, sure that it was headed somewhere exciting. Then, from the corner of her eye, she saw 2 men emerge cautiously from behind a row of dilapidated shacks that bordered the yard. They looked around quickly and began to run across the yard toward another train, which sat idly by, waiting its turn. To Frances's amazement, they hoisted themselves up onto one of the boxcars, slid the door open, and slipped inside, closing the door behind them. Hobos! She was sure of it. They were jumping on board the freight train, just the way Junius had described. "Hey, you there! What do you think you're doing?" Frances turned to see a husky, red-faced man gesturing angrily toward her. She stood still, unsure how to answer, as he approached. She could see that he had a wooden bat hanging from his waist. "Why, excuse me, miss," he said, looking perplexed. "You're not supposed to be out here in the yard. Are you lost or something?" "No," answered Frances. "I was looking at the trains." "Well, this is no place for looking," he said with a scowl. "It's dangerous here, with all the trains coming and going and switching tracks. And you want to watch out for the bums. That's what I thought you was, for a minute. A bum, trying to nab a free ride. It's my job, you see, to keep the bums off the trains." "But they don't do any harm, do they?" asked Frances. The guard looked surprised. "They're bums," he said, as if that explained everything. "If a person wants to ride a train, he needs to go into that station there and buy hisself a ticket. That's the policy of the Pensy, miss, and every other railroad I ever heard of. And like I say, it's my job to make sure nobody's trespassing in this yard. And that goes for you, too. You'd better come with me." "That's all right," said Frances quickly. "Thank you, but I'll just go buy my ticket now." "You do that, miss," said the guard. "A bit of a girl like you has got no business in a railroad yard." Frances began to walk away quickly. She couldn't help feeling glad that the 2 hobos had outwitted the guard, and she felt a glimmer of satisfaction at the thought that, by distracting him, maybe she had helped the 2 men sneak into the boxcar unseen. As she walked across the yard, excitement grew inside her. She pictured herself sneaking into a boxcar. It had looked easy when the 2 men did it. A small part of her brain sounded a refrain of all the warnings she'd been giving about riding the rails. "A bit of a girl like you has no business in a railroad yard. The world is a dangerous place for young ladies. Tramping is out of the question for Miss Frances." But no one had told her why. Junius had talked about tramping as a grand adventure, until Frances said she'd like to try it. One look from Mrs. Bailey and he'd stumbled all over himself, trying to act as if he hadn't really meant it. But Frances remembered the dreamy look on his face when he'd spoken of hopping a freight. The thrill of those words, "hop a freight," still filled her. She stood on the street for a long moment, torn by indecision. And then the answer came, so simple, she didn't know why she hadn't thought of it before. If tramping was out of the question for young ladies, she wouldn't be a young lady. She lifted her chin and began walking. After several blocks, she came to what she was looking for. A large sign on a corner building read, "Goldman's Clothing for Men and Boys." She pulled open the door and went inside. Immediately, a sales clerk approached her. "What can I do for you today, young lady?" Frances almost ran out of the shop, despite the man's welcoming smile. Instead, she took a deep breath and thought fast. "Please, I need to buy some clothing for my brother. He's just my size. We're twins, you see," she blurted. A part of her marveled at the ease with which lies kept coming out of her mouth. "Well, well," said the clerk. "Twins, you say? And what did you have in mind? A suit, perhaps?" "No," said Frances. "Some sturdy clothes for working outdoors." "Ah, yes. Winter weather will be upon us before we know it. I imagine you're looking for something to keep out the cold," the man said cheerfully as he began flipping through several piles of pants. At last he pulled out a dark brown pair and unfolded them for Frances to see. "These woolen trousers are very warm and quite serviceable." He held them up in the air in front of Frances at the level of her waist. "They look to be about the right size. You can make adjustments with these suspenders if you need to." Frances nodded. "I'll take them," she said. "And a shirt." The clerk helped her to choose a shirt woven in tiny brown and white checks, a short dark green woolen coat, a cap, socks, a pair of undershorts, and an undershirt, and a pair of stout practical shoes. From her money, Frances carefully counted out $7.50 for the clothing, thanked the clerk, and headed back to the freight yard, her heart thumping as she carefully scanned the tracks for the signs of the watchman. Seeing no one, she ran to a dilapidated shack by the edge of the tracks. Inside, she removed the harmonica from her coat pocket and placed it in her traveling bag. Then she took off her coat, her blouse, pinafore, stockings, and underwear, and began stuffing them into the bag. There wasn't room for her coat, so she decided to leave it behind, along with her lace-trimmed underwear. She picked up the new undershorts and undershirt and put them on, followed by the checkered shirt. It buttoned on the wrong side, which she found quite peculiar, but not nearly as peculiar as the feeling of putting on trousers. Frances had never worn pants before. She knew some ladies wore them for playing sports and relaxing around the house, but Father had not approved of the practice. Frances found she liked the way the trousers felt once she figured out how to fasten them in front. They were a little too big around the waist, but the suspenders held them up just fine, and the length was perfect. She put the money in her trouser pocket, then tried on the new shoes. To her surprise, they felt more comfortable than her own. Finally, she placed the cap on her head and gasped. Her hair. She reached into her bag and took out the silver hand mirror she had brought with her from home. Holding it away from her body as far as she could, she surveyed her image. She saw either a boy with long curly dark hair pulled up on the sides and tied with a navy blue bow, or a girl dressed up in boy's clothing. Either way, she looked ridiculous and was sure to attract attention. She removed the ribbon and tried stuffing her hair up inside the cap, but she had to muffle a laugh when she saw the way her hair made the cap bulge in a silly lump on top of her head. Quickly, she dug through the contents of her bag. She had brought no hats. Even if she had, they wouldn't be of a style that a boy would wear. Her comb and brush wouldn't help. Styling her hair differently wouldn't do. She realized she needed to cut it. She rummaged through the bag until her fingers touched the sewing kit engraved with her initials that held the tiny silver sewing scissors. Holding the mirror with her left hand and the scissors with her right, she froze, staring at her image in the glass. It would be easy to put her own clothing back on, buy another train ticket, and leave for Chicago. If I do this, she thought, there's no going back. Her mouth tightened in a determined line, and she lifted the scissors. Snip! She cut a tiny bit from the bottom of the long dark mass of curls that hung past her shoulders. Snip! Another lock, bigger this time, fell to the ground. Snip, 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 snip. It was a slow, tedious business. The blades of the scissors were only 2 inches long, and Frances's hair was thick as well as long. She needed 3 hands. That was the problem. One to hold the mirror, one to lift the hair away from her head, and one to work the scissors. In frustration, she placed the mirror down on top of her bag and continued cutting by feel, lifting a long strand of hair with one hand, cutting it close to her scalp with the other, and throwing it onto the floor of the shack. Slowly, she worked her way around her head. Snip, snip, snip. At last, feeling nothing longer than 2 or 3 inches, she figured she was finished. With both eagerness and dread, she picked up the mirror to look. Her eyes grew wide and her mouth fell open when she saw the image looking back at her. It was her own face that she saw, of course, but it was astounding how different it appeared without the familiar feminine halo of curls. She licked her lips, swallowed, and with one hand swept the hair back off her forehead and to the side, then paused to study the effect. Reaching for her new cap, she pulled it snugly over her head and adjusted it, so it came down low over her eyebrows. She narrowed her eyes at her image in the mirror and smiled with satisfaction. Not bad. She no longer looked like Frances Elizabeth Barrow, that was for sure. The funny thing was, She didn't exactly feel like her either. In her loose trousers with her short hair, she felt like a new person, someone rash and daring and free. Frances found a spot between two abandoned boxcars that allowed her to survey the goings-on in the yard without being seen. The train arrived with a squeal of brakes and clanging of couplings. A while later, another slowly departed, leaving behind trails of steam and pungent black smoke that filled Frances's eyes and nose and throat. Signal markers changed, beckoning trains into the yard or warning them to stop or to slow down. From time to time, brakemen, switch tenders, water boys, firemen with their scoop shovels for loading coal, dispatchers, engineers, and others passed by. And all the while, Frances kept carefully out of sight. She was especially watchful for the guard, who idly swung his bat as he patrolled. She noticed that every once in a while he disappeared into one of the little shanties, where he remained for several minutes. Frances had already chosen the train and the very car she planned to board. But it seemed that every time the guard went into the shanty, there was someone else around. She knew only that she did not want to make a mistake and get caught. She didn't care how long she had to wait. When she grew hungry, she opened the bundle of food Bridget had packed for her and ate a couple of biscuits and some cheese. She watched the sunlight move across the yard and begin to fade. After exchanging a few words with a man who came to take his place, the guard she had spoken with left. The new guard didn't seem to take his duties quite as seriously as the first. He went into the shanty and brought out a chair, where he sat. Unfortunately, he could look straight down the row between the cars where Frances was hiding and the tracks. If she ran for the open boxcar she had chosen to ride, she'd almost certainly catch his eye. Deciding to wait until night came to hide her movements, Frances sat on the ground, out of sight, and leaned her head against her bag. She must have dozed, because she woke to darkness and a flurry of activity around her train. She peeked out and saw clouds of steam coming from the engine. The guard was walking along the entire length of the train, holding a lantern. He appeared to be checking the connections between cars, the wheels, and the track itself. And, oh no, making sure that the boxcar doors were shut. Soon he'd be close to the car that Frances had chosen, a sturdy wooden-sided boxcar whose door hung open just enough for a slim body to slip through. She had to act fast. When the guard stepped between two cars to check the coupling, she ran from her hiding place, got to the car, threw her bag in, then pulled herself up and into the car. There was no time to close the door behind her, and the guard probably would have been able to hear the sound of it sliding shut anyway. She scrambled to a dark corner and huddled there, heart pounding, listening to the man's footsteps and to his tuneless whistle as he moved up the side of the train. When he approached the car, she imagined him shining a light inside and seeing her and dragging her out, saying, "Well, well, well, what have we here?" She held her breath as he stopped whistling and muttered something to himself. Then he heaved the door shut with a grunt and moved on to the next car. Frances exhaled with relief, but she didn't move or make a sound until she felt the train lurch forward and heard the rhythmic clackety-clack of the wheels as the train pulled slowly away from the yard, heading west with its cargo of lumber, steel, coal, and Frances Elizabeth Barrow.